He was. I'm going to go grab him.
I'll see if we need for a call on that.
Chairwoman, I'm going to go grab Senator Lombardo right now.
Okay, thank you. We've got a lot of witnesses signing on this legislation. This is a little, would you like to go first or last?
Sure, anytime you're ready.
What you want about
Sure.
waiting for Senator Lombardo?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Members. With regard to the legislation before you, this is very simple legislation. I had no idea it was going to create so much interest. So, excuse me if I'm not chronologically correct, but a number of years ago, perhaps in 1992 or 5 or 7, legislation was introduced by the Narragansett Bay Commission, which would allow it to acquire or merge with other wastewater treatment facilities across the state. This would be done by mutual consideration and in the mutual best interest of the respective agencies. That legislation, we thought, also contained legislation that would allow us to have discussions with not only wastewater treatment facilities, but also water agencies as well. Unbeknownst to us, I should say, we really didn't realize at that time that the language, for some reason, regarding water was left out of the legislation. There was no reason to revisit it in the recent past. But now we think it would be appropriate for us to have that authority. This is a generic bill. It doesn't speak to either Providence Water or any other water agency within the state of Rhode Island. It's very generic. It just allows the Narragansett Bay Commission, with mutual consent, with water agencies as well as wastewater agencies, to either merge or be acquired. It's that simple. It's an enabling act and nothing more. I'm available for questions. Any questions?
I think it's rather straightforward.
Very straightforward. It is simply an enabling act. That's it.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Lombardo?
Thank you, Madam Chair. There's not much more I can add to that. Vinny did a very good job explaining what it is. Again, all this is an enabling bill. We have some of the oldest infrastructure in the country when it comes to delivering our water to our constituents throughout the state of Rhode Island. Due to the fact certain communities in the state have their hands tied in, they use that money that they make from their water system and they put it into their general fund. And they're not taking any of that profit and reinvesting into infrastructure. If they do come to an agreement with NBC will take that profit that they have and invest it into the infrastructure and the replacing of the oldest pipe system, one of the oldest pipe systems in the country. We have a safety problem here. We're still using lead pipes to carry some of our water to our constituents. We're concerned about lead paint. They have to ingest lead paint. Water, right out of the tap, the lead is going right into their systems. I believe this is a good piece of legislation, and I hope you take it to heart and move forward with this. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer it. Thank you very much.
Okay, looking at a witness list, we have some people that have submitted written testimony. We do have a letter from NBC. The first witness signed up testifying is Pam Marshall.
Thank you. Yes. For Bristol County Water, and wanted to talk about this bill in particular. Obviously, this is a precursor to the possibility of the sale of the Providence water system. That's a whole nother big issue, so I'm not going to address that at this time. But I do want to address this bill in particular. First of all, I think there's a couple problems with it. It takes an old bill and just adds in water treatment. Now, a water system is obviously a lot more than water treatment, and I think if you're looking to do that, it should be described in the bill. Also, Narragansett Bay is PUC regulated, and it doesn't mention it in this part of this particular bill, but it's assumed that any time they assume another system, wastewater in the past, that it was PUC regulated. And that's something that was specifically excluded in the companion bill for Providence Water. But if it's going to be understood, it's going to be handled the same as wastewater. It should be also considered to be PUC regulated. And following the money is another issue. It's not spoken about in this part of the bill either, but Narragansett Bay Commission is an enterprise fund, and it should be totally separate from state funds. And as you know, this year the state did scoop some of their funding. That's strictly ratepayer funds, and we definitely object to that part of the state being able to take those funds once they're dedicated by wastewater or water customers. So,
Even though we know some of the water fees that go to, that are collected from the state from those water ratepayers go into, end up going into their fund.
and we heartily disagree with that, because they were specifically legislated for water projects and for water supply issues, and it's not to the ratepayers' benefit.
Right, and I'm not pleased with the schools either. So, any questions for Ken? Sarah Helen?
Yeah, I would share your concern about Public Utility Commission regulation, but I don't see anything in the bill that exempts NBC from that. The inference from your testimony is that this bill somehow exempts them from it. I don't
No,
see
but
that. I don't see that in the legislation.
there's a companion bill for acquiring water systems that does exempt it from PUC regulation. So I'm just saying it's assumed in this bill that all of the past dealings that Narragansett Bay has had with acquiring wastewater systems have been PUC regulated.
I think we respectfully need to be careful about our terminology. When you say there's a companion bill that does that, there's not a companion bill before us. And I'm not sure I even understand what you mean by a companion bill. Do you mean that the other bill is a necessary supplement to this bill, or is that bill separate and distinct from this bill?
There is a separate and distinct, but this is the precursor, let's say, for the other bill.
And what part of this bill makes it a precursor for another bill that is separate and distinct?
This is allowing Narragansett Bay Commission to acquire water treatment facilities.
And so why is it a precursor to what you characterize as a companion bill, but we've now learned that it's a separate and distinct bill?
Because there's been other bills submitted for the ability for municipalities to transfer their assets to Narragansett Bay Commission.
And what's the relationship between those other bills and this one?
This is allowing the Narragansett Bay Commission to acquire water treatment facilities.
Yes, it is.
And from what I understand, the other bill allows municipalities to transfer their assets to the Narragansett Bay Commission.
So, from your understanding, you think there is another bill that is a necessary complement to this bill, as opposed to being a separate and distinct bill that would stand on its own?
I believe they are companion bills from the way I see it.
And what is it about this bill or the other bill that makes one or the other necessary for passage and implementation of the other bill?
I think as I believe Chairman Marcellalo said, that they do not have the authority at this point to acquire water treatment facilities.
And that's what this bill would address,
And that's
correct?
what this bill addresses.
Right. Okay. it's another concern that you have about the scoops that the chair addressed. There's absolutely, would you agree, there's absolutely nothing in this bill that would facilitate what you've characterized as a scoop?
No, there is nothing to prevent it. And what I'm suggesting is that be addressed.
And that would be independent. In other words, you would object to the budget scoop, as you characterize it, whether this bill existed or not.
That's correct.
So that's also separate and independent of this piece of legislation.
It could be. I'm just suggesting it could also be included in this piece of legislation, since this is the one being modified.
Have you looked at the constitutional aspects of the legislature mandating budget processes to the executive office?
No, sir, I have not.
I think you should before, frankly, you start advocating that this bill ought to be amended to address that issue. Just check it out.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Conlon. Any further questions for Louis?
Thank
very
you.
much. Amy Meyer?
Good afternoon. Thank you for taking time to hear a brief explanation of where I think the Senator was going. Before I go too far, I want to remind everybody I am on a commission that's chaired by the chairperson across the table from me. And you raise good points. And you'll see in my memo that I had written to the Legislative Commission my concerns. That water supply is a far bigger issue than one bill, two bills, three bills. But there is an opportunity, much like sort of happened with the ballpark. It's a huge issue. It needs due diligence and it needs time. By that I mean, I don't think any one bill standalone is going to address all the issues. Water supply has been visited and revisited and visited yet again since 1964 when the late then Governor Chafee created the Water Resources Board. There are huge issues facing us. The pieces of legislation that I've circulated to all of you address some of these issues. There's opportunities under House legislation to increase tax benefits for manufacturing. As anybody knows, manufacturing uses water. The Providence system, we know Providence would like to sell or entertain some way of using capital dollars to offset pension issues or city issues, let's put it that way. The state of Rhode Island is in a similar dilemma. And we have to, if we're, pardon me, the scoop goes on, and it's certainly an indication that the economy is not all that vibrant. So hence the bill 8109 would seem to signal that there's a change in the wind, and let's put all of these forces that seem to be moving in a general direction, put it together with a thorough study and evaluation to come up with a piece of legislation, hopefully next fall or early next session, that really addresses the fundamental issues that we're talking about. I mean, it's not just simply Providence, not just NBC. NBC handles treatment, wastewater treatment. They do a fabulous job. I don't think anybody would argue with that. The bill talks about water treatment. And as my colleague Pam pointed out, there's the other side of the coin, which is the distribution systems. The southern part of the state is largely groundwater. The northern part of the state is largely surface water. So there's all sorts of issues to muddle our way through. So my concern is not that this bill is a bad bill. I just don't think it covers enough territory to accomplish what everybody would like to see. Ultimately, a win for the city, the state, and all utilities across the landscape. Be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you for bringing the other two pieces of legislation to our our attention. I'm reading here the letter that you submitted as well, and you speak in the third paragraph, basically talking about, I said, given that varying Providence officials over the years have proposed selling the water system, and that de facto regionalization continues through such efforts as evolution of the emergency interconnection program into wholesale interconnections. The Commission should recommend creating a water supply entity structured much like NBC, the referring to Narragansett Bay Commission. So, in your testimony, representing the Rhode Island Water-owned Association, it's not that you folks are adverse to a regionalization or structural.
No, not at all.
You just feel it
Needs to be fully vetted so that it does work for all parties concerned. I mean, we as I said, we have the sort of de facto regionalization. South Kingstown gets its water largely from Suez, as does parts of Narragansett. And these things are sort of evolving over time, but they're not evolving in a state or regional manner, which I think we all want to see happen at some point.
Started on together to study the Water Resources Board. We've been doing a lot of the work that's been done over the years, but just it's never come to fruition.
Right.
A lot of great planning, a lot of things, but it's always seemed like there's not enough money to look at this on a regional basis, and it has been talked about. This is probably the time to really look at this regional model. Thank you.
Do you have any thoughts? One of my issues is when we talk about taking public assets and we privatize them, right? So do you have any thoughts around whether it's the right move to move some to quasi-public agencies such as NBC or making it public?
I fully believe, I mean, from a historical standpoint, the state has tried to do things that it really wasn't able to do with a quasi-public, whatever you want to call it, commission. I just use the NBC model. It could be a similar organization, it could be an expanded NBC, but we have to get into why things haven't happened in order to make sure that the next step needs to be successful. We've spent the better part of 60 years sort of brushing aside water supply, and every once in a while, the chair has sat on I believe this is the third commission to study water supply. And I think I've been on just about all of them. In fact, even predated her ascendancy to the Senate. So I feel very strongly that it's a missing piece, and the state has, through no malice or forethought, has really sort of backed away from addressing these very structural issues that have gotten in the way of moving Rhode Island forward. I mean, we are supposedly the ocean state. We're the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, at least in the United States. But that's been a long time. And, when you look out Route 95, and if you're coming from the north, well, on the right-hand side, that was all Brown and Sharp. 12,000 employees. Now, if you're coming from the north, it'll be on the left-hand side. I mean, there's a message there someplace, and I think we need to pursue things through the Senators' Commission, and I think by next fall, early winter, we would have a distilled package that people could really get behind, both on the House side, the utility side, the environmental community. I mean, something needs to give in order to make Rhode Island, an attractive place to live and work.
Any further questions for
Thank you for your time.
Thank you for serving on the commission as well. Appreciate it. Next week is Friday. Next week Friday from the Rhode Island First Council here. Okay. The first name is Lorraine, and I'm not sure if you
Savard. Lorraine Savard.
Savard.
Yes, Savard. Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to speak. I am here giving remarks or testimony in relation to the Burrillville power plant. I know this is not part of the legislation, all right, but like I said, Burrillville Power Plant and the Clear River Energy Center's quest to attain water. I am concerned that this legislation will enable the Narragansett Bay Commission to sell our precious resource, water, to, in my eyes, an environmentally destructive industry. That is, water for a fracked gas power plant. This project in Burrillville has already been to at least 6, possibly 7 water boards, including Providence, in their search for a water agreement. Johnston, as you know, Senator Connolly, that agreement is in the courts, and the Fall River Watapa Water Board agreement is under scrutiny by the Fall River City Council. I don't pride myself in my ability to look forward, but I look forward in this agreement or in this legislation as an enabler for Narragansett Bay Commission or some private organization to sell water, our precious water. Thank you for allowing me to speak, and I will give written testimony, but I only found out about this 2 o'clock today, and I am extremely unnerved. Thank you very much.
Please don't be under, it has been posted, legally posted, late time. But I do understand.
Yes.
You have busy schedule.
Yes.
And we appreciate you taking the time to come in and testify. And we'll look forward to your written testimony as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
John Mahoney? Rupert will take you next. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I'd like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to go on record today. My name is John Mahoney, and I am the Scituate Town Council President. I will be brief, and I'd like it to be clear that I just learned myself about this bill on Monday. Myself and my Vice President are engrossed in a lot of day-to-day operations and restructuring of the town of Scituate in many ways. As we all know, Mr. Kettle is no longer in his chair, and respectfully, when I say this, Representative Quattrochi is not keeping the Scituate Town Council up to speed as to what's taking place here at the State House. Moving forward, Madam Chair, the Providence Water Supply Board owns 42% of the real estate in the town of Scituate. It contributes 21% of the taxation. And as a result of this fact, Madam Chair, the town of Scituate is significantly restricted in developing much of our town. As such, the town's ability to raise revenue through taxation of all forms is extremely limited. My testimony and intention here this evening is not to be an obstructionist. My concern is the future financial stability of the town of Scituate. Should the Providence Water Supply Board be sold off, leased to a private party, regionalized to some capacity, or obtained by the Narragansett Bay Commission? Again, not to be an obstructionist. And it's also important to note that I haven't had an opportunity to completely vet this out with our town solicitors. So some of my concerns, should this happen at some point in the future. Who will the town of Scituate be dealing with as it relates to taxation, or a pilot if a future deal requires one? This bill and House Bill 8123 are so wide range that there are many unknowns as it relates to the financial stability of my community. It's vague. It leaves the town of Scituate extremely vulnerable. What would happen, for example, if the town of Scituate lost the revenues it's currently receiving under the current taxation? How would my community be affected if the Narragansett Bay Commission or any other entity wanted to sell off property in the future? These are the unknowns. The town of Scituate is completely left out of all of these bills, to include House Bill 6122 and Senate Bill 0810 submitted last year in reference to a potential regionalization. So with all of that said, Madam Chair and members of this committee, I respectfully request that you please consider incorporating the town of Scituate to some capacity as it relates to these bills materializing in the process in which they will endure along the way. Negotiations at the Providence Water Supply Board. The Providence Water Supply Board owns 14,500 acres, which is a large land mass in the town of Scituate. No one would be more greatly impacted than the residents of the town of Scituate if the revenues we currently receive are no longer there or reduced. So my concern is, Madam Chair, members of this committee, we just want to be part of the process. We're not trying to be an obstructionist. We're not trying to challenge anything. And to be quite frank with you, this is so new, we haven't had an opportunity to vet it out. So I respectfully ask that this committee please consider allowing the town council to be part of the process.
Thank you very much. Now, the city currently have, is it a written agreement with Providence Water Supply?
Yes, ma'am. We have a tax agreement, which expired December 27th of last year. We renewed that on a 2-year, a short 2-year extension. So the town of Scituate and the Providence Water Supply Board, under a new administration, our administration, myself and my Vice President Mike Payette, who's here today, to give us time to take a hard look at of where we stand, the taxation and all that goes along with it. So we're in negotiations with them
So
now.
we have negotiations, the agreement expired.
December 27th.
Okay. And in the agreement that you had with Providence Water Supply, did it speak to protection of the land around the Scituate Reservoir? Was there anything in those agreements that...
It's quite lengthy. I don't recall everything. I'm not prepared to speak to that intelligently at this time. I wasn't prepared for that.
Is that something that the old agreement you'd be willing to furnish to the committee?
Absolutely, and it's my understanding the prior administration was prepared to re-sign the same agreement with the same multipliers. It was prepared prior to us, actually prior to November the 8th, 2016, the election day, and that's where it stands. So when we took office, we wanted an opportunity to really absorb it, and we weren't comfortable re-signing the same agreement with the same multipliers. And in there, there was language by the Providence Water Supply Board that the property that they would obtain over that 10-year period, that they would remain exempt from taxation. And that was somewhere in the area of 402 acres that they obtained over that 10-year period. So we did sign an extension with the Providence Water Supply Board, and we're working very closely. And I believe we get off on the right foot. And to say the least, the negotiations on the early stages are not contentious whatsoever. They've been...
We spoke about the revenues, concerned about the financial stability of Scituate. What kind of revenues are we talking about?
Right now, we have the Providence Water Supply Board contributes approximately 20%, 21% of the revenues in our community. And they own 42% of the town of Scituate, basically. They own over 14,500 acres, to include watershed, their plant, their processing plant, and all the infrastructure that goes along with it. And that has really, it has the town of Scituate in a position where it's difficult for us to generate commercial revenues and so on. So we lean very heavily on the property owner, primarily the residential homeowner, to carry the weight when the town is in need of a tax increase to maintain its operations.
So the reason that the town of Scituate doesn't pursue commercial development because so much of the acreage is devoted to the Scituate Reservoir and surrounding...
Yes, ma'am. We have very limited commercial space, yes.
Any questions for this witness?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, I thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Michael? Oh, well, we'll take the
Payette.
Yeah, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, and members of the committee for having me here. I'm just going to reiterate on what Council President Mahoney said. We're not here to be obstructionists. We're not here to oppose it. We're opposing it in its current state because we would like to be incorporated with it, just like the bills that we testified last year regarding regionalization. We weren't included at all. We're the host community. The reservoir's in our community. We should have some say on what happens, especially because it's not fair to our taxpayers. Should we lose the taxes that we're receiving from them, people are going to be, they're not going to be able to afford to live in their houses because the taxes, will just go up drastically. I know you asked the council president regarding the land and stuff. I did a little bit of research, but I know the water authority has been established for 103 years. After 100 years, so say they were to try to sell it, the deed clearly states that they cannot sell the land. They would have to give it back to who they took it from, which are no longer here, up to 100 years. After 100 years, if they were to try to sell it, the land would go back to the town of Scituate.
Would you mind furnishing that documentation to the committee?
Yes, we can get that to you. Yep. So, with that said, there is a lot of legalities regarding this bill, and we're just looking that we want to be involved so that however it moves forward, we can all work together. Again, we don't want to be obstructionists whatsoever. All right? Thank you. Yep.
Right now, the watershed area, I guess, around the reservoir, is that mostly forested?
It is, a lot of it's considered forest and farm space. However, the Water Authority itself does not need all the land that they have to operate the Water Authority. So again, with that said, if it were to go to a sale, a lot of that land, half of that land would have to go back to the town of Scituate, and the rest would remain for the reservoir. So I will get that documentation for you. But it's, that's why I think they were looking towards a sale and a lease of the land, because they realized in the deed that you can't transfer it to anybody.
So the lease of the land and that land would go back to the
Yes, yep, it would have gone back to whoever they took it from, but those people are, of course, no longer around, as well as family members, so.
And the land that they go back to, would they be allowed to do what they want on that land? Like if they wanted to cut down the trees and something else? Like
The Water Authority itself?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I wouldn't foresee them doing that because they like, the trees and everything to filter the water.
I really appreciate you and the Council President being here. Even though this bill doesn't specifically talk about those issues that you're talking about, the committee would really appreciate his background information.
Yes. Okay. Yes.
I guess, Sarah Ashbrook.
It's a quick anecdotal point. I have an historical book, and it mentions that in Scituate, when that reservoir was created, forgive me, 1920 or something, when they clear cut it, they planted, I don't know the number, 80,000, 100,000 white pine, small white pine seedlings. All of that pine forest you see around there was planted by people. And you don't think about that when you drive by. It's beautiful, but you don't think about that. So that's my useless piece of information for the day. But I think I inserted it at the appropriate time, right, William? Thank you for indulging me.
It doesn't have anything to do with the bill, but I don't think it was useless. It's very
You
informative.
always make me feel good, Chairwoman.
Yes, Senator.
if you don't mind, just adding on to that, we sometimes forget the amount of people in Scituate that we have to be thankful for, who gave up their homes and some, their lives to.
Yes, and as we testified last year regarding the reorganization, there were literally people that committed suicide because they lost their land to the Water Authority and to the reservoir. So,
Also happened over the Big River area, too.
yes, so, we have to be fair and good stewards, to our constituents and to the whole state. So, thank you for your time.
Thank you for your time, and look forward to those documents.
Okay.
Rupert?
Thank you, Chair. Members of the committee.
Rupert Friday with the Rhode Island Land Trust Council, and our interest in this legislation is something that was discussed in the Commission on Water Supply last week, and the lands that have been acquired to protect the water quality of Scituate Reservoir or whatever water supply, making sure that they stay protected if the water supplier changes hands, becomes part of the Narragansett Bay Commission. So that's our interest in this, and it's not really addressed in the bill the way it's written. So.
If your concern is that the areas, the watershed areas, are they protected?
The buffer areas stay protected. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
John Simmons? Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is John Simmons. I work for the Rhode Island Public Expenditure Council, and we are in opposition to this particular statute. And there are a variety of reasons that we are opposed to it. And if I can just start off, as a major policy area, one looks at 60% or 100% of the water supply that is within the state itself. You are now making a choice, although it's enabling, but if you provide enabling legislation, your expectation is that it will be used. And so this means you're now making a policy decision that the water treatment facilities in Rhode Island will be run by the Narragansett Bay Commission, because you have several features in this bill which we are really concerned with. One is, for instance, the idea if the town and the city or town agree with NBC, all statutory construction around the water treatment facility, charter, ordinance, resolutions, etc., are no longer to apply to that facility. So if you have something, for instance, does that mean that it is no longer regulated by the PUC? Does it mean that it is no longer controlled within ordinances of the town or any other application of state law on environmental quality of the land, of the water? Does it no longer apply? We read it as you are exempting that merged entity away from any applicable law, charter of the state of Rhode Island. One of the other items on this is looking at just the town or the city that is the owner of the treatment facility enters into an agreement with the Narragansett Bay Commission. Who else is going to be involved in that transaction? And we'll take Providence. That's a $300 to $400 million acquisition and transfer of property. Is that just between the two entities? As we read this, it is. So the city can make a deal with the Narragansett Bay Commission to acquire that facility. And to Chairman Conley's question about control over that, I'd like you to go to the very last page of it. And here, when one reads this issue, any sewer or water use fees, charges, or assessments in effect or merger to remain in effect and may be assessed, collected by its commission in accordance with a particular statute. Any change in the sewer or water use fees, charges assessable shall be subject to the approval of the Public Utility Commission, excluding, and here's the applicable part, excluding costs related to the acquisition, merger, or consolidation. So if there is an acquisition price of $400 million, the PUC is not to be the regulatory entity controlling what that is or how that applies to the ratepayers once this acquire occurs. So if you look at the threshold, one is they are exempted from any applicable public law, state law, local charter, ordinance. They are not regulated now on their acquisition, merger by the PUC. So who is now protecting the ratepayers in this state? And so I ask of you to take further study of it. I would say to you, Mr. Chairman, and I have spent a lot of time, I was on the Bay Commission with the chairman at one time, and we always thought that this was a rational approach to take the Bay Commission and the water district's water supply systems and see whether that's a rational and reasonable approach to do it for economies. Well, we believe that this is sort of the cart before the horse. We don't know what this enabling legislation will do or mean. We believe that this should be further worked, further enhanced, that you walk through the variety of things that could occur that you may want to re-bring back to the bill itself. But we believe right now that you will be effectively taking all water treatment facilities, and here you're going to have a problem between treatment facilities and distribution systems. The reservoir, for instance, is not the treatment facility. They have a separate one. So is it not the reservoir? Is it not the pipes in between? And how do you do rate structure for those if you take them out? So
So we believe that there's a lot of issues in this bill that ought to be re-examined prior to taking any action. We believe that, however, it should be explored because, again, the Bay Commission is an entity that's been here for a number of years and is well regarded as far as how it's treating water or the sewer treatment facility. So with that, Madam Chair, I'd be more than willing to take any questions. And there's written testimony as well. The Rhode Island Business Coalition is also opposed to the bill as well. Thank you. Which represents about 35 trade associations representing most of the employers in the state. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. My name is Meg Kerr. I'm with the Audubon Society. We also have concerns about this bill that have been covered by other folks that have testified here. In principle, we have no objections to the Narragansett Bay Commission becoming a regional water supply. We've testified in the past about the idea that a regional water supply would be a good thing for the state of Rhode Island for a variety of reasons. But we are concerned about that line that was just read by Mr. Simmons about the Public Utilities Commission not overseeing the acquisition. We're concerned about that. And we're concerned about the protection of the watershed lands. I know this is not specifically about Providence, but any water supply that the Narragansett Bay Commission were to acquire, we would want to be sure that lands that had been protected to protect that water supply remain protected after that merger was accomplished. And that could be something that could be added to something like this in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks. I'm Sheila Dormady with the Nature Conservancy. We're an international organization with offices here in Rhode Island and Providence, and 75 miles of hiking trails that are lovely around the state. I urge you to go out for a hike. We are opposed to this legislation for that same line at the bottom of the legislation for the lack of PUC oversight of the acquisition costs. That is a fundamental issue for the Nature Conservancy because there is the potential that without the right consumer watchdog or oversight of the negotiation of what those acquisition costs are, you could end up saddling a quasi-public agency with a significant bill that would undermine their ability to make the appropriate investments in protecting their infrastructure, upgrading their infrastructure, and protecting the environment and the rest of the natural resources related to that. That said, so we do oppose this legislation, just to be clear. We do support the idea of the Narragansett Bay Commission being able to take over water delivery systems. While this says water treatment facilities, it appears that it is intended to be more about the fuller definition of water systems. And that idea actually has the potential to provide significant both environmental and consumer benefits through an integrated approach to water management. That's something that the US EPA has been supporting, is connecting our drinking water with our wastewater treatment, and I would even go so far as to add stormwater management would be an appropriate piece to integrate into that kind of responsibility. To be looking at all of those parts of the natural process together, you could really have some significant cost savings by doing that. So the fundamental concept is a good one, but the lack of the POC oversight is a problem. We would also just echo that because a lot of the dialogue related to this bill has been related to the Providence Water Supply Board, finding a mechanism that you're going to be able to protect the lands of the watershed through any merger process is going to be an important piece of that. Just to elaborate on what other folks have said here, right now, the people of Scituate are extraordinary stewards of the lands of the Scituate watershed, and the Providence Water Supply Board has a strong policy of protecting the lands of the watershed, but those are not permanent legal protections. There are some permanent easements on some parts of those watershed lands, but a lot of them are really just protected by policy. So we would want to make sure that there is something stronger and more effective than that in any process that would be transferring the management or ownership of those resources. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Amy Moses?
Thank you, Chair and members of the committee. My name is Amy Moses. I'm the Rhode Island Director at the Conservation Law Foundation. We're a regional environmental advocacy organization working throughout New England. We are opposed to this legislation, and we have two primary concerns that you've heard about this evening. One is what's missing from this bill, and as Sheila, Meg, and Rupert have mentioned, we would like to see language added that does protect the land and the watershed. Currently, it is being well taken care of, but there's no guarantees that that will happen in the future. So regardless of whether we're talking about the Scituate Reservoir or another body of water, we think it's important that the committee consider amending this legislation to put protections in there. And second, we are also concerned about the PUC legislation, the last line of the bill. We think it's important that there is oversight for the transaction costs. We're concerned that if there isn't this sort of oversight, that inappropriate transaction costs could be passed on to ratepayers. So we think oversight is critical. And finally, just briefly, there are a handful of terms in the legislation that are undefined, so it makes it a little tricky to figure out how it would work, particularly if this was a vehicle to acquire the Scituate Reservoir. For example, the term facility is not defined, so it's hard to figure out which community would have a vote if this were to happen. So I would encourage you, if this bill is moving forward, to pay close attention to those terms, the term board, the term facility, and it's I think it's already been brought up. There is a water supplier defined term in the statute, but that's not used in this legislation. So it's hard to figure out exactly how it would work without knowing what those terms mean. Happy to answer any questions.
Do you have any concerns about the usage of the water? If it would change from the water supply board, like take the Providence Water Supply Board and moving that to the Narragansett Bay Commission, what they actually allow for usage of the water?
There are a lot of open questions, and I'm not exactly prepared to testify on that because it's not in this bill, but there are public laws currently on the books governing how the water supply can be used. Chairman Conley is rather expert in those laws. So there is a concern if an entity and laws and regulations governing it no longer existed, then what would happen?
So it could potentially change, though, with the change of who's controlling the water, those laws that apply today.
In theory, there's an open question there, but we need to look at that in more detail. And because they are public laws, it's a more complicated area to research. They weren't codified in the general laws, but it is certainly a concern. Thank you.
Thanks. And I don't know if you've had a chance to, I don't want to ask unfair questions. I don't know if you've had a chance to see the letter that was submitted to us from the Public Utilities Commission.
They were not willing to share that letter. They thought it was important that the committee saw it first.
I agree with that.
So I haven't seen it.
No. I may ask you just a couple of questions that kind of relate to some of that information, and because I think it's important information. Everybody, for obvious reasons, just to give what's in the paper today, everybody's focusing on this bill as though it's a specifically designed bill for MPC to acquire the Providence Water-owned. What about, do you see this, and if you thought about this at all, as this bill having an impact on some of the other smaller water supply systems throughout the state, and MPC's ability to acquire some of those other smaller water supply systems, with the idea that that's not exactly a regionalization opportunity, but a consolidation opportunity to address some of the concerns that Senator Lombardo talked about in terms of investment and enhancing some of those smaller, older systems. Is that anything that anybody's thought about in regard to this bill?
Certainly. I mean, I think people have testified that there are larger conversations. There's a study commission going on. This bill in and of itself is just enabling legislation that pretty much expands the authority of NBC to allow them to merge or acquire with other water boards. It isn't necessarily the Providence Water Supply Board, but regardless of what entity they might choose to merge or acquire, we are concerned about the lack of protections for land in the watershed, and we are concerned about the lack of PUC oversight.
Now, agree with both points, but I just wanted to at least clarify, because as I look at it, and I understand why everybody's focused on it, it's a bill that also enables the acquisition a lot of these smaller water distribution systems throughout the state.
Correct.
Yeah. And everybody's focused on the language that, not everybody, but you and others, and I think correctly so, have been focusing on the language and the last phrase in the statute, excluding costs related to the acquisition, merger, or consolidation. But frankly, I've been trying to understand exactly what that means and how it would be applied. So it does say that any change in the water fees, charges, and assessments shall be subject to approval of the Public Utilities Commission. So it doesn't, on an operating basis, it doesn't exempt the NBC if it acquires the system from PUC regulation, right?
In general, correct. It does exclude any regulation of costs related to the acquisition. And as I think we've all read in the paper, this is an extraordinarily valuable asset. This would not be a simple, typical real estate transaction. So there could be substantial costs involved in transferring it.
So, agreed. So does the language, and maybe it needs clarification, but does the language say that in any changes in those water use fees, charges, and assessments, cannot, I want to rephrase that if I may. Do you understand the exclusion language related to the acquisition or to the rate setting?
My understanding of this bill, which is quite different than the one that was before this committee last year, is that PUC would retain its oversight of the fees. However, there's just this carve-out where any costs related to the acquisition, PUC doesn't have oversight of that one thing. But regular rate setting and so forth, it appears that they would continue to have the oversight that they have now.
So there's the concern. The concern is that the language doesn't simply say that the PC won't regulate the acquisition, but that somehow the PUC forfeits some portion of its rate setting calculus in setting rates. Is that a concern?
Well, if such a transaction were to take place, it would be a big, complicated transaction with lots of professional involved. So it would cost a lot of money, and in our view, it makes sense for the PUC to be able to regulate that, to keep an eye out for the ratepayers, to make sure that there are no inappropriate costs involved in that transaction.
Understood, but okay, so I think I've clarified, at least in my mind, that the language does exclude the oversight of the acquisition, but still maintains the integrity of the rate setting functions of the Public Utilities Commission.
That is my read of that sentence as well.
Yeah, okay. Now, the other thing that's interesting is that, and this is part of the PUC note to us, and if you thought about this, great. If you haven't, that's okay too. But under our regulatory concept right now, PUC is advocating, I think, with pretty good authority, that it's the ratepayers who have essentially bought, acquired, and operated the system. And essentially that asset belongs to the ratepayers. Is that, do you understand?
I am familiar with that position. The PUC included that in their testimony last year, that the typical regulatory scheme would be ratepayers. I have not personally evaluated that legal question, and there appears to be a difference of opinion between the PUC and the City of Providence as to who has true ownership of the asset.
No, thanks. I just was wondering if that's something you had thought about, if CLF had. Because I actually do think that's probably an important question to answer for this bill.
Certainly.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
And I think as has been mentioned, there are many, many, many ratepayers who do not live in Providence.
Right.
Just one follow-up to the question earlier. So does this mean that the rate may not change, or QC still has oversight of that, but it doesn't stop, say, an additional fee on your bill for these acquisitions that people might get charged? Is that
My understanding is PUC would retain the oversight of rates and fees, just the big ticket cost associated with this acquisition. The PUC would not have oversight over that.
okay?
Further questions?
Thank you.
That looks like that concludes the witnesses unless there's anyone else. Go for it.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. Topher Hamlet with Save the Bay. For reasons articulated by the Rhode Island Public Expenditure Council and my fellow environmental group advocates, we oppose the bill as written. We are not opposed to the concept of a regional authority. In fact, our neighbors to North Massachusetts has the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority, which is a large-scale water and sewer authority. So it's not unheard of. My guess is that there are lots of those around the country. I do want to bring us back to a meeting that was held at this table last year around water supply management in the state. And I think a major issue was identified, and that is our current way of managing water resources in the state. Both the sources and the delivery systems needs fixing. There's no question about it. The legislative task force on the Water Resources Board and Water Supply, which is working right now, I think is the best place to holistically look at water supply issues in the state. So to me, for Save the Bay, I think looking at large-scale changes in management, ownership, control of water systems in the state, I think would be best served by your task force completing its work and hopefully making some recommendations that include not only the city of Providence's issue in NBC, but also water supplies around the state. So we think you're doing good work, and we would like to see that work continue. And any major policies, bills that are enacted, hopefully will come out of that work. Thank you. Yep.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And please allow me to apologize for my outburst, and members, please. Huh? Well, yeah, I mean, I can only imagine, I'm on the House Finance Committee, so I can imagine any of you being in front of my committee and someone coming in and attacking you politically, making a political attack. So this is my second year, so, I'm trying to get my legs, but. So,
You're welcome here. Relax.
well, okay, thank you. Thank you. I actually didn't come here to speak. I should be in finance now. I came here to listen on behalf of my constituents. And, and I'm not going to repeat everything that's been said. I am against the bill. While I was sitting there, I did just write a couple things down. Apparently if this organization can be sold, what's to stop it from being resold and resold again? What's to stop it from being sold to a foreign entity that may not have our interests at heart? As far as accountability, since I've been in office, and I'm sure you all also do get contacted by your constituents, so many times, and I have to say, when I try to go to bat for them at the agencies in the state, I get very, very little satisfaction from my constituents. And I think that creating such a huge monopolizing water authority would be an accountability disaster on steroids. Honestly, that's my personal viewpoint. And one of the senators, I think, may have asked about, if it's on paper, if Scituate protects, if it's written down that Scituate is supposed to protect the reservoir. well, I don't know if it is or not, but certainly for 100 years, I've been in the town for 50 years. I'm the oldest of 7 kids. My 2 daughters went through the school system, and we are excellent stewards of the water. We take very good care of the reservoir. We are faced with very different challenges, having the reservoir being in the middle of our town. We have 4 volunteer fire stations, one at each corner of this reservoir. So you can imagine, rather than being able to have a centralized fire station in the middle, we have 4 volunteer fire stations. The police station was at the southern end of town. To go anywhere, you have to go all the way around this reservoir. So we do have our challenges, and it comes with a cost. So price, cost, all kinds of different costs. But that's all I want to say, and I hope you accept my apology for my outburst. Thank you. Thank you.
Anyone else that wants to speak?
If you just indulge me for just one moment. So if you just indulge me for just one moment. First of all, I've been on the Narragansett Bay Commission since its inception. And one of the benefits of being on for 40 years, more than half my life, is you have a historic perspective of things. So, first of all, the Narragansett Bay Commission's record on the environment is pristine. Never, not one time in the history of the Narragansett Bay Commission has everyone questioned the motivations of the Narragansett Bay Commission. The only thing we've been accused of, and you've read about this, is the Narragansett Bay is now too clean. You may have read that. It's too clean. So any discussion about the motivations of Narragansett Bay Commission, we feel, are unwarranted. Our history does not indicate that at all. Now, if the committee wouldn't mind being entertained for just one moment, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Public Utilities Commission. You understand that when Narragansett Bay Commission was created, we were not regulated by the Public Utilities Commission. So having the benefit of being here 40 years, I can explain to you why we are. The reason why we are regulated by the Public Utilities Commission, and by the way, we are a public utility. Not a public utility as like National Grid, but a public utility. And the intention of having members appointed to the Narragansett Bay Commission by their appointing authorities, the mayor of those originally Providence, Johnston, and North Providence, was to have an appointee to the Narragansett Bay Commission that would oversee rates for their respective constituents. Confronted with property tax issues, well, we could talk about this because I think they're all gone now, right? I think they are. Yeah. The mayors got together and said, we don't want to raise taxes. We have an election coming up. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to pass on the responsibility of collecting sewer rate fees to the Narragansett Bay Commission. We're going to make them a retailer, because originally, Narragansett Bay Commission was a wholesaler. We used to send bills to the City of Providence, Town of Johnston, Town of North Providence. So the mayors decided, here's what we can do. We will make Narragansett Bay Commission a retailer. They can send the bills to the various users of the system, the ratepayers, and we do not have to send a check to the Narragansett Bay Commission, therefore creating a left-handed tax increase. I don't know if everyone understands that logic. So basically, it was a red herring for putting Narragansett Bay Commission under the PUC. The original intent was to have their representatives on the commission to oversee the welfare and benefit for the constituency. So I think it's very important for the committee to understand that Narragansett Bay Commission is a public utility, not a private utility. And as a public utility, our members are there to make absolutely certain that when there's consideration of a rate impact, that they are there by their respective appointing authorities to make absolutely certain that it's necessary and that it is required. Thank you.
Thank you for that explanation.
You're welcome. May I be excused, Madam Chairman? Thank you very much.
We're very happy that you've been joining
I don't want to get a call from someone, one of the spirits. So, thank you.
Madam Chair? Yes. Less historical though, but just thought about wordsmithing. A lot of the attention and testimony has been about that last phrase, including, of course, the academic consolidation. And I think it's been broadly construed by some of the witnesses in a way that I don't think it consistent with the legislative intent. But here's the balance. Here's what I think the balance point is, and what we may need to think about, is that there are those other smaller water systems that are not public utilities. Not every water system is a public utility.
It's true.
So there are those smaller water systems that are not subject to PUC regulation. And without speaking for all those water systems, it would be a legitimate concern on their part, at least I think it would be a legitimate concern on their part, that it's their asset, it's not a public utility regulated asset. Why should my sale of this asset be subject to public utility regulation? And so I think that we need to think about that, because smaller systems, which is why I talked about in part about these public utilities, there's an argument, whether you agree with it or not, I'm not sure that I do, but there's an argument to be made that it's owned by the ratepayers.
Right.
Those other small, and that's why they need to be regulated. Those other smaller systems that may be the acquired facility are not governed by that. And in the vernacular, they can sit, why should the public utility get in my kitchen when I want to sell it?
I agree with you. We learned that.
So that's the balance point.
How many private water authorities there are in the state. It's amazing.
So you can kind of, I just think that's a little legitimate concern for those smaller, unregulated water systems.
Right. Because they are currently unregulated.
Yeah. So, less historical than closing we just heard, but
No.
I just thought it was important
But
to
it was a very good point.
finish that line of thought.
And a
That's
lot
all.
of people don't understand that there are water utilities out there that are not regulated like you say. We learned that at the Water Commission.
Yeah. So,
Right. Only 5 of 29 major water systems are regulated by
Right.
PUC.
right.
Yes,
I just have a question about that point. So for the smaller water systems that aren't regulated, because I don't have the benefit of serving on that committee, I mean, is there information that we could look at about, what, the customer base might be? Because to me, it strikes me as if there's a smaller water supply versus trying to move to a larger regionalized, system, it just seems to me that the more customers or the more, homeowners you're affecting, the more need for kind of regulation, because all of a sudden the financial incentives from the top are different. That might have an impact on the water delivery system, the ratepayers. So.
No, it's a known quantity. Department of Health has it. Water Resources Board has all those figures. It's not a secret.
Yeah.
But it's also a lot of the issues that have to do with the lead issues and things like that. That if we look at this on a regional basis, it might be a better way to handle a lot of issues. But anyway, I digress. So, I guess we will move to hold this for further study. We have such a motion by Senator Conley, seconded by Senator Boyer. All those in favor? Aye. Those opposed? Motion for adjournment? By Senator Conley, seconded by Senator Boyer. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? We are adjourned.